Thanks for organizing this. Very weird to be sitting here in Montreal and wishing that I was really sitting in Paris in the same room with everybody and talking to everybody. So of course it is an unusual time in the history of our world. I'm not sure how much people how people's minds work in the Zoom environment, how much can be absorbed or how much gets reflected. And what I wanted to do in my talk was start off by showing some demonstrations. If you don't remember anything else, maybe you will remember the demonstrations. And in future work, you'll try to figure out what it is that you're actually, how your brain is actually seeing these demonstrations. So can you see my screen? Can you see those dots over here?
Yeah. Yes, we can.
Okay, so this is a
They're
little
not moving yet, but they will probably move.
Okay, well, no, they won't move, but they'll change. So, so this is a pattern of 400 random dots. I will now take 400 random dots and I will rotate, I will take 400 random dots. I will take the same sets of 400 random dots, but superimpose them on the initial dots, but in a rotated position of 5 degrees. And now when I look at it, I see some kind of circularity in that particular image. I'll now take 400 random dots and I will rotate them by about 25 degrees. And when I look at it, I might see something happening, but I no longer see the circular image. In this image, each dot is correlated with another dot that's rotated around the center by 25 degrees, but I can't see any correlations there. So that's one demonstration. A second demonstration is a demonstration that comes from physicists in Boston University. This is a demonstration of something that's called the wagon wheel effect or wagon wheel illusion. You can imagine that this is a digital demonstration. Of course, it's much, much better if you have an analog demonstration, but we can't do that. Imagine this disk spinning at 450 revolutions per minute, and it's being strobed with a strobe light. This is imagine that's in a dark room, and then you have a light flashing on it with a period of 33 1/3 milliseconds. That's the length of time it takes one stripe to go to another stripe, two other of these long stripes. In this case, it's stationary because you're at the resonance frequency. If you rotate this wheel slightly faster, then you see this kind of aliasing. This is called the wagon wheel effect. If you rotate it somewhat slower than that 450 RPM, you also see it, but now you see it going backwards. If you change the revolution period by a lot, it can get to be quite complicated. It's hard to tell what's happening sometimes, but then you can actually find that there's another resonance condition around here. And there are a whole bunch of other conditions in between, some of which are hard to see, some of which are much better to see in analog also. So that's an example of the wagon wheel illusion with a demonstration put up by people at Boston University. Now, if we can, let me just see if I can Well, let me just do it this way. Okay. So now you can see this wheel. If you can't see what a wheel with a whole bunch of spokes and some text on the right, somebody shout out, I think you can see it. This is an image of a wheel with dark stripes. And you can imagine this spinning also. This is now spinning in daylight. And you can say that tau sub r is the time it takes for one spoke to get to the next spoke. And then I'm also going to have a little propeller going around. I don't know if you can see me. I could see Julie when she was talking, waving her hands in the air. Anyway, you can have a little propeller going around, and the time it takes that propeller to go around is given by tau sub s. And let us imagine that this propeller goes around at a time tau sub s, which is exactly the same as tau sub r, the time it takes for one spoke to get to the next spoke. And let's say the disk is also spinning quickly, and this propeller is going around quickly. I'm going to now look at the spinning disk through the propeller and ask you quickly to think and see if you can figure out what you can see. What you end up seeing is you see a negative image of the spinning disk. Where there were dark stripes before, you now see faint light stripes. This is actually a photograph that was taken through that spinning propeller. So that's another demonstration. So my talk is about correlation and synchronization in visual perception. After I finished a PhD in statistical mechanics of liquids in Chicago, I went to Edinburgh, and there I had a wonderful mentor named Christopher Longa-Higgins. I was there studying vision. I wanted to study vision in the brain, shift from study of statistical mechanics to vision. And Christopher said to me, if you have a new insight into vision, you should demonstrate a new effect. Christopher took a trip to Eric Harth's laboratory in Syracuse and brought back a demonstration that can be done with Xerox machines of that vintage. You take a blank piece of paper, you take a copy of that blank piece of paper, then you iterate. You take a copy of the copy, you take a copy of the copy of the copy, etc. And when you iterate that, you end up with a pattern of dots, kind of random. I was interested in computing the spatial autocorrelation function of that pattern. I studied spatial correlation functions in theory of liquids, and I thought, well, that would be interesting to look at. To do that, I made a transparency of that pattern of dots to shine on the wall in a bullseye pattern to compute radial distribution functions, local autocorrelation functions manually. And from superimposing the transparency on the initial piece of paper that the dots were on, I shifted one, I rotated one by around a few degrees, and I found these circular images. Christopher thought that this was extremely fascinating, encouraged me to write this up, which I did. The notion developed in that paper was the visual system computes a localized autocorrelation function and integrates the localized autocorrelation function to generate a global percept. The way that this could have been done, we also suggested, Hubel and Wiesel had recently done what would turn out to be their Nobel Prize winning work on the functional architecture of the cat visual cortex, in which they observed simple cells and complex cells. In our context, the simple cells could respond to the correlated dots, and the complex cells could now integrate that over local regions, and then you would have to form the concept at some further regions. This is not my figure. This is a figure from Candel's neurophysiology book. at least some of these notions had been supported by experimental work. This is one paper that was a cover paper in neuroscience from Movshin's laboratory, where they were studying activity of nerve cells in macaque monkeys that were consistent with the sorts of hypotheses for information processing that we made. I've only written a few papers about these stop patterns. Here's a list of the 3 main papers that I wrote. Then there was also an article in Scolopedia. So these patterns were called glass patterns by David Marr, and we have a review article with Matthew Smith. As far as the theory of perception of these, there are a number of papers that have come out over the years. I haven't really tracked them all. Steve Grossberg, Steve Zucka, Hugh Wilson are all people that may be familiar to some of the people here. I think that all of the papers, as far as I read them, are consistent with the notion that the visual system is computing a localized autocorrelation function, because that's indeed the signal. Now, this was a stationary pattern. There was no motion in it, but we were interested, had interest in how we can perceive motion. So in order to perceive motion, we had an idea, and the idea was developed with Ron Shimko, who was a graduate student in physics department with Elliot Montreux in Rochester when I was in Rochester. So we had the idea that the brain might have its own intrinsic strobe, and when you were seeing things in motion, when you perceived motion, you would essentially take those strobe images generated by the brain's internal strobe, and then you would somehow or other correlate what's in subsequent images, and the correlation would give you the cues for motion. We had the notion that you could take this disk, I showed you it already, you could spin it in natural light, and then because of your brain strobing, you would actually see the wagon wheel effect. You could see stationary images at certain frequencies. In fact, something like that had been described by somebody named Schutten in 1967. When we spun the disk, we could not see any strobing due to the internal properties of the brain. However, when we were doing it, we accidentally moved our fingers in front of our eyes back and forth, and we saw negative images. So the negative images we saw, that was a picture that I've already shown you. We published this in an article in a journal called Optical Engineering in 1975. We also did a series of experiments and theoretical work in which we both varied the strobe frequency as well as the duty cycle of the illumination. So varied the strobe frequency, the duty cycle of the illumination, and we observed what was happening. The main thing that we observed, or one of the main things, was that there were resonances. So when the period of the strobe, of this propeller going around, and the recurrence period, the time that it takes one stripe to get to the next stripe, when the ratio of those had low, simple integral ratios, then we tended to see resonances. And it's some of the resonances we could see an integral number of stripes. So if we had an image with n stripes, we could see m times n stripes, where m was a small number. Now, I stopped doing vision and studied heart cells with Michael Guevara, Alvin Schreier, and others in the 1980s. When you study these heart cells, these are little balls of chicken cells that are beating spontaneously. You can stimulate them with a period which can be different from their intrinsic period. When you do that, you see a bunch of locked, synchronized rhythms, phase-locked rhythms, as you vary the period on the x-axis and the amplitude of the stimulus, you see a variety of different of these resonances. In this context, it's called Arnold tongues after the great Russian mathematical physicist. And in this system, you could also see chaos over comparatively narrow regions of the parameter space, which we described in a series of papers. I was always interested in the notion of whether it was possible that entrainment of nonlinear oscillators may play a role in the perception of the resonances in the wagon wheel effect. We had the opportunity to study that when a fellow named Patrick Martineau came to do a postdoc with me in between a PhD in cosmology and a medical degree. He had a year off as he was transferring, and he did work with me. We set out a goal, which is to do one of these wagon wheel effects, to take a disk with a certain number of equally spaced spokes, spin it around, spin it with any speed, strobe it with a strobe of any frequency. So now this would be doing this in a dark room once again. Strobe it with any frequency, any number of stripes, spin it, and be able to predict what it is that you would see. The simplest idea, I think, that anybody who sees the wagon wheel effect says, oh, of course, it's very simple. I understand exactly how it works. And the basic idea is that when you strobe this, you have a series of different images, and somehow or other your brain is seeing the simplest image, which would be based on the correlation from one frame to the next that you would possibly see. In order to describe this mathematically, by the way, the idea of spatiotemporal cross correlation is certainly not known. People who do vision and neural networks will be familiar with classical work going back 50 years or more from Werner Reichhardt and perhaps many others subsequently and maybe some before. To describe this mathematically, the fairy sequence comes in. The fairy sequence is the sequence of integers, ascending sequence of rational numbers whose denominator is less than or equal to some integer. This is the fairy sequence of order 6. So given the ideas, there's trying to do the mathematics to implement the correlation model. We did the mathematics. I'm not going to try to go through it. And we were able to predict what you would see using that correlation model of a spinning disk. On the x-axis, we have the time between the strobe flashes and the recurrence time, the time it takes for one spoke to get from one place to the next place over. On this axis is the time between strobe flashes. And we did a computation. In that computation, there is only one parameter. The one parameter is something that I would call the integration time of the visual system, which is how many images can you put together to, in some sense, integrate together to see something. This comes in a variety of effects, and this number is about 200 milliseconds. The different colors represent different resonance zones. This purple is the period 1 zone where you're freezing the image like I showed you. You see exactly the same number of stripes. The green that you were going to see twice the number of stripes that were there, and so on and so forth. The dots are from data that we collected when we did the experiment. So we set up a rig to measure the wagon wheel, and we did that experiment. Okay, so the correlation model does pretty well, but what about the notion that nonlinear oscillators may be involved, that there may be some entrainment? So we developed a mathematical model. The mathematical model is of a periodically forced nonlinear oscillator. We modified a model that was put forward by Jacques Belair. This sawtooth is meant to be a nonlinear oscillator. The period of that is the recurrence time of the image, the time it takes one stripe to get to another stripe. The strobe is a vertical impulse. If this downslope of the sawtooth hits that impulse, it resets to 0, and then it starts going up again. So this is actually similar to the integrate and fire model that David mentioned. If this ratio is equal to 0.8, the time between the strobe and that recurrence time is 0.8, you see a 1-to-1 image. And if it's 3-to-2, you see a, if it's 0.7, you see a 3-to-2 image. You can once again do the computation if you assume some value for that number t, and we take the ansatz that it's 2 times ts divided by capital T. Capital T is 200 milliseconds, which is the integration time of the human visual system. There's some mathematics, or not to compute the locking zones. You can look at the images that you get. They're very close to what you observe. These dots represent the boundaries of these different zones. You can see a whole bunch of different zones. This is spinning some stripe. That's data we collected. There is, as far as I can tell, one other paper that tries to do systematic studies. That was from a paper that was done in 1984. We took data from that paper, we plotted it on our figure, and as far as we can tell, it's basically quantitative. Things are almost exactly in the right place. The basic ideas of the talk is that the visual system computes localized spatio-temporal correlation functions and integrates the local correlations to generate a global percept. I pose the possibility that phase locking of neural oscillators might play a role in the computations involved with movement perception. Open questions of the roles of eye movement. This is particularly for the wagon wheel and everything maybe. Bistability near borders of regions and the neural substrate for the system. There's a series of papers going back in the wagon wheel. This is not complete, but I'll point out that probably the first good paper was by Michael Faraday in 1831. I mentioned the paper by Schouten. Edgerton, a person who developed strobes, wrote something. Our paper in 1975 was not cited between 1975 and 2009, when we cited it in a paper that we wrote that was published in PhysRev Letters. And I will point out that the strobing, the notion that the visual system can strobe without a strobe, is something that had a rebirth. And there are a series of papers. The first one was by Purvis's group, published in PNAS in 1996, talking about the wagon wheel illusion in movies and reality. We cannot see anything when we do it. I do not know what they're doing when you just look at that image. Thanks to the people who I've collaborated with. Sorry that I went a little over, but I'm happy to answer any questions.